Hey, this is fun. We haven't even started talking about luminosity and emptiness. So
Yeah, we're just preparing. We're just
that- that's
setting the scene still.
where the real guts come into play. Cool.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so just to make sure we're on the same page with an understanding of cessation. Speaking to Ruben and people in Rob's tradition, my understanding of their understanding of cessation is it's a complete cessation of all experience whatsoever, including an awareness of awareness, meaning that there's no memory of any experience whatsoever when it ends. Um, and yet, paradoxically, there's a sense of things coming back online, and it can last like a few seconds, or in some cases, it can last like, a week or two with very
Two,
advanced
you're dead.
meditators.
Not 2 weeks. If you do 2 weeks, you're dead. A week.
A week. Um, yeah, so is that what you're referring to with cessation? It's because
Yeah.
what I was cautioned against is some people maybe think cessation is similar to like a 5-MeO DMT experience where all sense of self and all thoughts and everything else disappears and is just sheer, open,
That's
luminous
different.
kind of nothingness. But
No, that's
you're talking
that's
about
more
cessation, even that drops away.
that's different. So I've done 5-MeO, so I can talk to you about that. That's more nirvana, not nirodha. So this is again, I love this. The granularity here again is very important. So both of these terms, nirvana, nirodha, are prefaced by the negative term of negation, nir, which is nir, um, which is parenthetically very interesting because fundamentally the nature to access the nature of these dimensions of mind and also fundamental reality, this is a process not of accretion but of negation. The whole path is really fundamentally the via negativa. That's the emptiness path. The via positiva, cataphatic, is then that's the luminosity aspect path. But briefly, nirvana, I'm sorry, nirodha means cessation. Nirodha samapati is the attainment of cessation. There are other types of samapatis. There's samjnika, I think that's how you pronounce it, samapati, which is a different type of cessation associated with cessation of perception per se. But this is important because um, there's a difference between cessation and extinction. So extinction, nirvana, transcends but includes nirodha. And this is actually important. I know Ruben's work beautifully. I consider him a dear friend. He's one of the great contemplative scientists. And I know personally, I won't mention the name, n equals one, subject number equals one. I know the person he studied. He's a friend. And this person has this capacity, and others do, to enter voluntarily this completely mind-bending state where they can intentionally shut off dualistic consciousness and enter this point of complete cessation. Now, let me say this, and I say this with, again, with some reservation, hesitation, but it's also in the tradition. So this is not me bringing this forth. This is magnificent as this state is. There are again near enemies to this because Nirodha is not the same as Nirvana. It's my experience with 5-MeO is more Nirvana. You go to the Dharmakaya. It's you don't you cease total construction of space-time self, but you don't black out like you do with Nirodha Samapati. This is a more Nirvana experience. And so, as important as Nirodha is, it's a post-jhana state, right? It's the ninth jhana. These jhana states are incredibly important. So when I stumbled into my meditation thing 30, 40 years ago at this point, this was definitely a glimpse of this space, these jhana states. They're not emphasized hardly at all in the Mahamudra Dzogchen and Tibetan traditions. And the reason for this is, again, I say this with some qualification, is amazing as these states are, and they truly are, they're still the penthouse of samsara. They'll get you reborn in a God realm. It's the very best of what samsara can be, but it's still not nirvana. There's still a so-called relapse. It's not stable. It has tremendous benefits and capacities to do exactly, this is now Nirodha Samapati, exactly what I talked about a half an hour ago, When you can slow down the mind, stop it to such an extent that the entire machinery that creates sense of self and other just gone, gate. What is super compelling when you come back out of a space like that, and my friend talks about this behind the scenes very elegantly, is in my experience as well, you see the whole machinery come back online. And so therefore, people who have the capacity to do this, arguably the greatest gift of it is to articulate exactly what the Buddha did, what I refer to as the intellectual content of enlightenment, which are the teachings on the wheel of life, Praticca Samutpada, the Bhava Chakra, the teachings on the 12 links of dependent origination. This is this phenomenology that takes place when the mind gets so still, so quiet, so ceased, that you actually then see it becomes your direct experience. You see how these 12 links come together moment to moment, life to life, to create your reality. So that is arguably the greatest benefit of doing these cessation states. But the near enemy, and let me give you, again, this is a strong example, but let me give you an example of the limitations here. I love this stuff because, again, blind spots, right? It's like with Prasangika, we're pointing out some blind spots. Well, here is a blind spot of the Samapatis and the Nirodhas, I should say, and also the Jhana state. So a dear friend of mine, this is so great. A little exaggeration here for dramatic effect. He was attending one of the supreme Dzogchen masters of the age. And again, I'm going to keep from naming these so I don't offend anybody because they go, no, he never said that. Well, this friend who was at his side for 12 years told me once that a monk came to him and asked my friend, I'd like to have an audience with Rinpoche because I want to talk to him about my jhana states and my shamatha. Um, and my friend went to this great Dzogchen master, and paraphrasing, the master said to my friend to say to the monk, throw the bum out. I don't want to talk about these states, right? And so the reason for that is like I mentioned before, these extraordinary states, the fruition of mindfulness, the fruition of shamatha, um, it sedates, it doesn't liberate. And so this is the near enemy of this kind of complete cessation is sedation. What liberates is vipassana, is insight meditation. And so coming out of that space, right? The people that come out, that's when they apply the vipassana. That's what liberates. You come out and your mind, you're gone. You come back on, and I can share some of these experiences, like when I come out of extensive dark retreat. This is where these experiences arise in my own template. You, like I mentioned, you can see the whole machinery kick back into gear. This is profoundly transformative. But this is a classic, this is one of the distinctions, by the way, between first turning Theravadan approaches, no criticism at all, and Mahayana Vajrayana approaches. They look slightly askance at this. They transcend but include. They say these are great states, but be very, very careful. This is mental candy. These are spiritual sweets. And if you're not careful, I can't resist the play. You'll get truth decay because you think you've attained awakening when you've just attained cessation. And this is what happens. I won't name names, but if we were offline here, I could give you 10 people off the top of my head who have attained, tripped into these samadhi states, and they think they're effing enlightened. They've just been temporarily opened and experienced these domains of cessation. And the reason they're so profound, parenthetically, the reason they think they are awake is because the cessation of the contraction, they open, they dissolve into these states of cessation. They confuse it with awakening simply because of the contrast of the preceding levels of contraction. So very briefly, but super important, fundamentally, what we're talking about at these highest stages is extremely ordinary. It's literally extraordinary. It's literally called in Tibetan Tamil Geshepa, ordinary mind. And this is super important, practically speaking, and then I'll pause. because we very often we're driving for Hollywood type experiences, grand fireworks displays of light and bliss and whatnot. And it's more like Oklahoma. It's more like Kansas, which in the US is just really simple, boring. And so we miss it. On our way, we look for the grand experience when fundamentally it's always already fundamentally present right in front of us. It's just so ordinary. So this is why this is so great, Amir. This is why Suzuki Roshi allegedly said, I love this line. Enlightenment was my biggest disappointment. Why? Because he was already so open. He was already so ceased that it was the ultimate letdown. It's the ultimate downer. But he was already so open, so let down, so down that when he finally collapsed, it was like, no big deal. This is important because otherwise we think we have these great psychedelic experiences, we have these amazing meditative spiritual experiences, and we forget the underlying phenomenology that brings about these experiences. And this is fundamentally openness. And so I'll invite this as a contemplation for your listeners, and then I'll pause. Look below any experience to which you would append the label spiritual, mystical, meditative. And I promise you, you will find underneath any one of these experiences a quality of openness. What characterizes, what brings about an experience of spirituality is openness. Synonym for openness is emptiness. You see the empty nature of reality. And so, if this is in fact true, and I invite your listeners to kick the tires and see if it is true, well, why not practice openness? That's what meditation is in my languaging, habituation to openness. Why not practice openness to such a degree that every experience becomes spiritual? Then you're no longer stuck on spiritual cocaine. You're no longer a spiritual junkie waiting for the next spiritual hit or the next psychedelic hit. If you understand the underlying phenomenology, that underneath any one of these experiences is a quality of openness, why not practice openness and make your entire experience spiritual? This is the great gift of my 3-year retreat. This is a way I entered lifetime retreat in the context of my daily life by understanding these processes and realizing, let me just practice being open, loving, kind, patient. Now, my life becomes spiritual. Every day becomes spiritual. And so I like this because this is like translational spirituality. This brings it front and center, applicable, and very, very practical. So anyway, long rant, but really great, important topic. I kind of circumambulated some of the key points around Rubin's work in the road to Samapati, but if you want to come back to that, I'm happy to unfold it. Those are the main points, at least in my experience of it.
No, I just mainly wanted to make sure that when you said cessation, you were referring to the same thing that I understand as being cessation. Although I've not experienced cessation, but I've had people use the word to refer to what seem like different experiences, but I think we're using it in the same way. It just gives a certain foundation for the next questions. But I do want to get to the that debate and your perspective on it. But before I do, what you said just brought up one more question, which
Oh,
brings me
right.
back to the two things we spoke about earlier. One is this kind of East versus West. Is there one goal, or could it be a creative act? Are we just part of, not just, are we potentially part of the play of manifestation and the many incredible manifestations that can actualize? Or is there a direction or telos or kind of one goal? Is there one enlightenment? Is there, an awakening that's the right one versus one that's not quite there? Um, and yeah, the little riff you had around, oh, what if we were always opening and what if everything was always a spiritual experience got me thinking again to something Rob Berbea said. He was a bit of an iconoclast and he had a whole lecture series on questioning awakening. And he said some things which I found very beautiful around, well, there has to be space for Beethoven waking up in the middle of the night sweating because he realized 3 notes that he'd already sent to the publisher were in the wrong place and rushing to make sure before, there has to be place for the love story and for, but even more like day to day, the mother giving birth or the chick pushing through a eggshell or, where you stand up to a bully or these moments in life where we contract, where we push, where we more like an 80s movie where you've got the kind of thing where you're preparing for the boxing match or whatever, and you're doing the training montage, um, which isn't a state of kind of open and relax and let things go. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you have a way of reconciling those, or you are kind of like that's all just more suffering and kind of it doesn't matter. The notes are the way they are, and just relax, Beethoven, go back to bed. It's like not that big a
Yeah. Oh, these are so
yeah.
great, Amir. Thank you for these very thoughtful questions. So again, this brings back into play these two, I think, mutually supportive, if they're related to properly, paths of fullness and freedom. And so when we work with the path of fullness, then so to speak, enlightenment, which isn't a term very often used with the path of fullness, but goals can be used. The goalposts here are moving. They're moving because structures of consciousness are moving. This is where evolution takes place. The fundamental nature, it's literally called changeless nature, emptiness, Turiya, Dharmakaya, 100 names for that which cannot be named, Ayin. This does not evolve. It's like saying space evolves. Well, space doesn't evolve. Space is changeless. Well, that's the path, returning, recognizing the spacious, open, empty nature of our being. That's the path of freedom. This is a wonderful way. Rupert talks about this a lot. It's really beautiful. Recognize that the deepest dimension of your being is this infinite open space. That doesn't change. And that's why when I mentioned earlier, what constitutes sleeping, dreaming, all these other states of consciousness, these are just various degrees of expansion and contraction upon this fundamental spacious openness. In fact, it's not even expansion to get really subtle. The only thing that ever actually happens is contraction away from that space. Expansion is simply the cessation or relaxation of that contraction. And therefore, this is why you can't actually ever become enlightened. You simply cease to be deluded. Let me say this again. You can never attain enlightenment because you're already enlightened. You just don't recognize it. You simply cease to be deluded. You simply cease to be contracted. This, by the way, ties in, maybe we can talk about this later. This is what death is all about. Death is just a non-negotiable, forceful method of liberation, what I playfully call the grand opening. And so if you relate to death properly, it is the penultimate way to experience this. So to come back, on the path of fullness, the goals are always changing as developmental structures change. I mean, I'm not as interested in playing with Ken and Barbie as I might have been 60 years ago, right? I'm not interested in watching cartoons. If that age, that was my goal. That was my enlightenment. I'm now interested in whatever. And so the key for me now is my whatever is that still Barbie and a cartoon compared to what may be beyond. This is where my lust for humility, my passion for humility and openness is so key. Always being just acutely aware of what I don't know. What did Josh Billings, sometimes attributed to Mark Twain, say? It's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you do know that just ain't so. I just love that line. So on that level, that baby is always changing as developmental structures evolve. We
And if
can.
and if you apply it to some, do you still play piano?
Oh yeah, right around the corner. I have my 8 foot semi-concert grand. Yeah.
And just to take this very practically, like someone hands you a really hard piece, one that you're passionate to learn to play. What is your process now with that? Do you do you keep coming back in that process? Just let me just keep trying to open and relax, or is like, okay, no, now I'm gonna have to focus and I'm gonna like kind of breathe in and create a little bit of energy and contraction here mindfully to
Yes.
really conquer or absorb this thing that my brain doesn't really want to do. The brain stressful to
Yes.
learn, like on a biological level, it's a bit stressful to have to learn something new.
That's fantastic. And I guess that what you said was really beautiful, Amir. I love your languaging. Mindful contraction. Because
Mm,
fundamentally, there's nothing problematic with contraction whatsoever. It's just like ego. Ego, in a certain way, is archetypal developmental contraction. That's all it is.
mm,
There's nothing wrong with contraction. I couldn't move my muscles
mm,
if I didn't contract. We talked about diaphragms earlier. I couldn't breathe if I didn't contract. My heart wouldn't beat if I didn't contract. If I didn't reference things to myself, I couldn't operate in this world. I need contraction at developmental, biological, epistemological, and ontological levels to function in this world. There's nothing wrong with that. What you said was so beautiful. It's mindful contraction. It's engaging in this focus, in this intentionality, in this operating in the world through mindfulness, with mindfulness, so that then when we contract, another way to talk about this is archetypal lucidity and non-lucidity in the dream world, is then I contract lucidly, voluntarily, volitionally. I understand that I'm acting, moving, engaging in this way. Otherwise, what happens is habit patterns take over, karma takes over. And because these habit patterns and karmas are fundamentally driven by developmental structures, then ego just rears its continuous ugly head. So that transcend but include approach then becomes, I think, worthy of reintroduction, understanding the extraordinary beneficial roles of contraction. Because otherwise, what happens is this is also like the difference between spirituality and so-called materiality. If we don't understand properly the relationship between openness and contraction, spirituality and so-called materiality, we put our spirituality not merely in contrast to, but in opposition to the material. So then, parenthetically, what happens to your spirituality in your material world? Like when, you and I both had surgeries and hernia surgeries. How do you make that a spiritual experience? That's a pretty damn material event, right? Well, you do it by understanding this play. And so, just again, in the balancing approach, you then bring the openness, the mindfulness, the openness into the contractions. And so then that's a game changer. Then you don't have a preference as kind of dual aspect monism. Then you have the ability to swing very gracefully the pendulums between these two worlds, and then therefore operate very effectively in this world. Because otherwise, in the pejorative sense, you're just going to grow a beard and go sit on a mountaintop and watch the world burn. That's not what it's about.
Mm.
So hopefully that was kind of a tangential approach to a really good set of questions. So hopefully I hit it. But the last thing I did want to say in terms, okay, you get me going, Amir, you're not going to get me to stop. In terms of the path of freedom, the journey is the goal. There is no, this is interesting and helpful for us in the West. We think that somehow enlightenment represents some kind of static awakening. We enter this particular kind of stasis. No, in the Tantra traditions, it's literally referred to as entering the action. And so, therefore, my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, wrote a book by this title. The journey is the goal. And then you realize, well, connected back to the issue of telos and purpose that we talked about an hour ago, well, where does that fit into this, right? So then it's endless. The play is endless. And so is the goal perhaps to realize that there is no goal in the sense that the journey is the goal? I don't know about you, but there's something profoundly liberating about that. Because then my languaging, I playfully say, stop rescheduling your appointment with reality. You're already in this awakened state. It's always already there. Dao Frijan used that term. The issue is one of recognition, the immediacy of it. And this is what constitutes true non-dual spirituality. The true non-dual path is the path of recognition. Like it says in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, recognition and liberation are simultaneous. For the non-dual people, this is incredibly impactful and important. And we haven't turned to this topic at all, but this is really, really huge when you talk about things like the clear light mind, when you talk about, nirvana. Well, where exactly is this nirvana? Where exactly is this clear light mind? Open your eyes, look up. This is it. There's only nirvana. Samsara is a partial or complete lack of recognition of it. There's only the clear light mind. It's just our lack of recognition of it. And so this in the non-dual traditions is critical because the only thing you have to do is open the aperture of your awareness. The path is perceptual, not actual.
Mm.
Let me say that again. The path is perceptual, not actual. You're not going anywhere. Just like in a dream, you think you're traveling all over the place in the dream. You only have to look back from the waking state to realize you never went anywhere. And so, in exactly the same way, you're never going anywhere. Just open to the fact that you're already always already awake. This is incredibly impactful and empowering. It's utter immediacy of what we're looking for. It's the cessation. Here's the cessation. It's the cessation of the entire notion of spiritual path. Spiritual as a, again, like I mentioned, as opposed to what, right? Well, I playfully say this, there's only two things wrong with the term spiritual path. Number one, use of the word spiritual. Spiritual as opposed to what? Material. Where does your spirituality go when you have an operation and you're in a heap of hurt and you're dealing with a meta crisis and you're dealing with the world on fire? Where's your spirituality then? Second thing, path. A path to where? Seeking denotes the absence of that which you seek. Where can you go that this particular dimension of experience isn't? And so outside of the term, spiritual and path, spiritual path is pretty perfect. Both terms then become very subtly obstructionist because, oh, I have to get on my spiritual path. I have to go somewhere. I have to go on. Again, provisionally, I'm not dissing this, man. I spent 3 years in retreat. I've done tens of thousands of hours in retreat. I still do because I'm not stable yet. But all of it, paradoxically, is in the spirit of there's only two things you need to do. Stop doing. Open, relax. That's it. That's it. Exactly what happens when we die. Exactly what happens at the highest levels of the path. Cessation.
And I really want to get to this Jay Bernardo debate, but I want to slip one last question in very quickly, if that's okay. You mentioned you weren't stable enough, you didn't have a cognitive um,
Infrastructure. Yeah.
framework to understand the experience at the time, but the experience you were having was that reality was seeming more and more dreamlike and dreams were seeming more and more real. I'm just curious if now you are in that state or you can return to that state much more comfortably where waking life feels more dreamlike and dreamlike feels more real and it's a functional state that you can like operate in and have this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to be, again, I would, yeah, in my tradition, we're kind of sworn to secrecy and there's reasons for that. And I used to be very, very tight-lipped about all these sorts of things. But I realize when I listen to people that I do really respect and they have the courage to share some of their experiences, I have to say when it's delivered properly, it warms my heart and it inspires me. And so that's not to say I'm at that status of any of these other people, but for sure, one of the things that has characterized my path, and again, this is why it's so kind of resonant with the um, stages of awakenings, as I've come to understand it, is I had this 2 week transmission 50 years ago where the world appeared in this particular way. That was literally a pointing out transmission. In Buddhism, it's called the third of five paths, which is five stages on one path, but these are helpful to know. The path that you really want to get at in this life is the so-called third path, right in the middle. It's called the path of seeing. It's literally when, for the first time in your life, you see the nature of mind and reality, and it's a non-retrogressive experience. The light turns on, so to speak. It may not be stable, but for the first time in your life, the light turns on, and you see. And the analogy that's given here is a good one. It's like you're living your life in a big auditorium that's pitch black, and there's a big snake in there. Just imagine the visceral kind of relationship to that space. Fear, anxiety, I mean, just like, whoa. So your whole life is lived in this stadium with this big snake. And then one day you're moving around and you bump into a light switch and the light comes on, and what you thought was a snake is a rope, right? Light goes back off. But what happens? You're no longer afraid because even for that brief glimpse, you've cut through the snakes. The problem with us is we see snakes everywhere, right? The world is full of snakes. And so when you have a path of seeing, your elbow comes up against the light. Oh my God, these aren't snakes. These are ropes. Parents, the snake is not in harmony with reality, the rope. That's why we suffer. The path is to bring appearance in harmony with reality. Then you wake up. And so the light comes back off. That's why the third path is never stable. People think they are awakened when they have the third path, but that basically doesn't happen. And I heard Rupert say beautifully in a recent podcast where he talked about this. It was really, again, it really warmed my heart when he talked about like where he is. I was like, wow, Rupert, high five. So then you enter what's called the fourth path. It's a path of meditation or the path of familiarity. And then what happens is, like Houston Smith put it so beautifully, the journey is to transform flashes of illumination into abiding light. So then it's more familiarity, it's more stability, it's more constancy. The light is on more and more and more. And so this has been my journey over 50 years when that light came on and I saw the nature of reality in this way. And then over the years, because I was able to retrofit, stabilize the practice, enhance it, and then go with specific practices that are designed to bring about the experience I had spontaneously, that's a big deal. So that yeah, it's more stable. The world doesn't have the same bite that it has. You develop, I like to use this analogy of X-ray vision, the superior vision of the Taoist tradition. Appearances still arise, everything still arises, thoughts still come up in my mind, appearances still arise, but now I'm more and more lucid to it. When I'm in a non-lucid dream, by definition, a dream, normal dream, I'm buffeted around by the contents of the dream. I mistake them to be real and I suffer. And so I wake up, I become lucid, the appearance is there, this dream's still there, but now I see it as a dream. And that's huge. Very subtle shift, butterfly effect, super subtle shift changes everything. And so, yeah, it's more stable, more constant. And, perhaps at a certain point it will be 24/7,
Can
but
you
not yet.
experience physical pain in a dream?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. In fact, I did. One of the cool things about these nocturnal meditations, this is another conversation we could have, the five nocturnal practices and what they
Mm.
are. Path of nocturnal practice. Been huge for me. For sure. I did a series of experiments just personally on my own in a number of lucid dreams several decades ago where I did exactly what you're suggesting. I actually said, geez, everything I do in the waking state, can I do it in the dream state? Well, I can see, and we can actually talk about that because who's saying what in there? That's super interesting. But then I went through it. Well, I can hear, yes. Well, can I feel pain? Well, let's see. So I was in a lucid dream. I remember it very clearly. I conjured up a rose bush, a dream rose bush. I put my dream thumb into the dream rose bush, and it hurt like a mofo, right? And so everything you can do in the waking state, you can feel and do in a dream. Now, if you really think about the depths of that, now you start to see the extraordinary importance and the gift of things like dream yoga and the nocturnal meditations, where in fact you study, I think I mentioned this in the conversation with Bernardo and company, the double delusion, the example dream, the nighttime dream, as a way to exactly gain these insights, to extrapolate them back to this dream. This is the primary dream. And then use those principles to wake up from this dream. That's like I mentioned an hour ago, that's the fruition as I see it. So,
Wow. Yeah, that's the one thing that still gets me, which is well, first of all, thanks for sharing your personal experience. I think potentially in the East, where everyone's immersed in the mythology of it and surrounded by statues of Buddha, and everyone's got this kind of conception, and maybe that's my projection of what life is like, the
right.
D Disney version. But um, here there's a lot of probably confusion around what the path even is and what kind of states can arise and what can happen, that it's useful to have people, without making a big deal out of it, just say, yeah, like I experience a lot of bliss now, much more than I used to, or things don't bother me as much, or life feels more dreamlike. And if everyone stays secretive about it, there's nothing to inspire us really. And but the question I wanted to get to was, um, so after this hernia operation, I there was a lot of pain at times. And thank you.
Wow.
You sent me your book, Reverse Meditations.
Oh, right, I forgot I did that.
Yeah,
What
it was really useful. And I've meditated for a few years now, and so I have had those experiences where pain transforms from pain into kind of pressure, neutral pressure. Um, and so it was instructive because I noticed how, first of all, I'm not at a point where, unless I stayed very focused on the pain, the minute my mind started to wander, so I could transform pain away from being pain to just pressure,
Yep.
as long as I stayed very focused on it, and because I don't have a very stable mind, you know, I was very motivated because sometimes it was really sore. So it was
No
good. The
kidding.
motivation
Yeah.
level was high. But same thing, like I had like 1 or 2 days of a very severe headache, I think, from tensing up so much. Um, and like I'm not at a point where I can stay focused for 48 hours. So I could do like 30 minutes of relief, 40 minutes relief. So that's one thing I noticed. And the other thing I noticed was I could do it if the pain was maybe 6 or 7 out of 10. Beyond that, I was just like
Survival. Yeah.
in like, oh, I hate this. I want it to end. What life is just a cruel joke. You know, it's like, how dare the universe create life if this is what it's like? And then I was thinking of people who live the majority of their lives maybe in a 7 or 8 or a 9 out of 10 pain, and the horror of that. I apologize again. I've asked you a very big question before what the kind of the main dish. We had lots of appetizers, but I wonder if there's a couple of things you want to say on that since you have studied pain.
Yeah.
But do you know the headline question actually that I'll insert
Yeah.
here is what I've learned recently is that there are no pain receptors. There are damage receptors that in the brain get translated into pain. So I would have thought that a more sophisticated meditator could be like, actually, I'm just going to reinterpret that as damage. It's good that I know my body is being damaged. I might have to take some kind of action, but I'm going to prevent my brain interpreting that as kind of a freak out self-torture. Is that possible?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's just go very briefly to an extreme fruitional example of this, one that has really impacted Bernardo. And actually, John F. Kennedy said the most impactful photograph ever taken in history, the voluntary self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc, the Vietnamese monk who set himself voluntarily on fire in protest of religious persecution during the Vietnam War and entered state. It's difficult to say exactly where he went. He could have entered Nirodha Samapati on the spot, or my take is he entered immediately a space of complete, utter open awareness. And this is really beautiful. So what you're saying, I love this because now we're talking cash value. Now we're not just talking metaphysical mumbo jumbo spiritual stuff. We're
Yeah,
talking
because I'm
about
thinking that was painful. There's definitely life definitely has more of that
for
in
sure, for sure. So I think what just this extreme example, and then we'll come back to make it applicable. Whether it was Naroda Samapati, who knows? Very likely because he's the Theravada master. But he also could have entered the state of complete open awareness. And when you work with open awareness, which I write about since moment of shameless self-promotion in my meditation book, reverse meditation book, this is where you work through this practice to mix your mind with space. Space is analogous. It's a so-called physical analog to emptiness. And so, as they say again in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, emptiness cannot harm emptiness. And so, for someone like Taekwondo, or we can aspire to do that through these meditations, space has incredibly interesting qualities, right? You can't bomb it. It's on one level, it's the softest thing in the world, right? Put your hand up, try to touch space. Is there anything softer than space? No, there's nothing softer than space. But it's also the most indestructible. You can't burn it, you can't bomb it, you can't cut it. And so with Taekwondo, fruitional levels, it's entirely possible through a practice like open awareness, which for many of us is much, much more applicable and accessible than Nirodha Samapati and the higher graduate school of Jhana states. Those are tricky. They're so difficult. Open awareness is not that difficult. Well, I think what happened with Thich Quang Duc is fire can't burn space. And so he was sitting in complete meditative equipoise because he was so open. Dare we say he turned that fire into a spiritual experience because he was so open. And so let's make this really practical. And I invite you to maybe retrofit your experience. When you're having experiences of, let's just start with suffering, even before we get to pain. So when we get to suffering, I love this. This is really practical. So I have this little equation. I love my background in mathematics comes into play here. An equation more important than E equals mc squared. S equals P times R. Suffering equals pain times resistance, paren contraction. Well, do a little math, drop the resistance. You basically transform the suffering, you reduce it, but you're left with what? pain. So this is how you deconstruct suffering by doing what, Amir? Opening to it. If you resist your pain, this is the second arrow that you talked about an hour ago. The second arrow is you resist the pain, you contract against it. That converts simple pain into complex suffering. So the reverse meditation strategy is you do the opposite of what you would normally do. Instead of running away from the contraction, remember earlier, find the openness in the contraction? You go into your pain. You open to it. And as you open to it, first thing you do is you deconstruct your suffering. You're left with this thing called pain, which then you can even deconstruct further as you stay open, you become more and more open to that, where fundamentally you realize that pain, again, tying it to the non-dual riffs, pain can be deconstructed into nothing more than really intense, raw sensory awareness, because that's all there is. That's all there ever is. And so what creates the experience to which we would append the label pain, right? Look below, converse to the examination earlier, when we looked below spiritual experiences, we found openness. Look below any experience to which you would append the term suffering or pain. I promise you, you're going to find contraction. 100%. This contraction expansion thing has tremendous explanatory power. So you realize that, right? You go, wait a second, wait a second. I playfully say, we're always pinching ourselves and looking elsewhere for the prick. We're the prick. Double entendre intended. We're always pinching ourselves by our inability to stay with really intense experience. And so this applies not just to physical experience, it applies to emotional experience, to what's happening in the world today. And so when you have this hernia thing, and I've had it too, and I've had kidney stones, and I've had some really wicked ass surgeries. Every time I have this now, it's not, oh crap. It's like, oh wow, I get to practice my reverse meditations. And so you work with open awareness, you open to the experience, you allow yourself to go in. And this is, I'll pause here because again, this we can run on this for a long time. What happens here is beyond profound. If you completely reverse your strategy, so if you want to go, even beyond level 7 all the way to 8, 9, 10, this takes a little bit of familiarity, strength, and practice through open awareness, but eventually you can do it. Where what I'm going to say is like, you got to be effing kidding me, but it's true. By becoming one with your pain, there's no one to hurt. Let me say that again. By becoming one with your pain, there's no one to hurt. It's like what T.S. Eliot said so beautifully about music. Music heard so deeply, it is not heard at all. You become the music while the music lasts. Pain felt so deeply, it is not felt at all. There's still something there, right? This ties into luminosity. This is luminosity, intense experience. That's luminosity. But you go into that experience and open to it. Openness is a synonym for emptiness. You realize the openness, you realize the emptiness of that luminous experience, and therefore you deconstruct it. It's still there. You could still be in the lab and they'd be still seeing these nociceptive fibers firing off and all that kind of stuff. But what has happened is something you have complete control over. You may not be able to control your circumstances in a dictatorial sense, but what you can control are the dictates of your own mind. You can control your relationship to this experience.
Can
This
you
is the
get to a
path.
point where that's what do they call it? Sorry, I'm blanking on, where you have conscious competence and then there's unconscious competence. Like you could probably play a familiar piece of piano without thinking about it. Like I said, I could have moments of this when I was very much concentrating on it, but then as soon as my mind wandered, it was very painful. Can you get to a point where you're unconsciously just like, oh,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, 100%. And again, your language is revelatory, my friend. You nailed it. Whenever your mind wanders, you felt the pain and the suffering.
yeah.
Listen to what you said. Because when this is so profound. To distract etymologically means to pull apart. This particular word has tremendous multivalent applicability. And so when our usual cultural training, this is the default mode of the Western world, is when you're hurting, you distract, you want out. This is the basis of the multi-trillion dollar entertainment industry. It's a narcotic business. It's basically to entertain literally means to hold between. Entertainment holds you between you and your intense experience. And so what the mind does in its perverse attempts to make things better, it distracts, pulls away, wanders from the experience, and you nailed it. In the very instant of wandering away from it, you create the suffering. Isn't it amazing? So this is where you reverse the strategy. And it is not easy because it's in our biological matrix to do this. It's culturally indoctrinated. Everything in this whole spectrum of inappropriate relationship to unwanted experience basically brings about this process phenomenology of transforming simple pain into complex suffering. So easier said than done. That's why it's a path, it's a practice. You reverse your strategies and you do it. If we have more time, we could do a little exercise with it. You reverse it, you go into it, you establish a relationship to it, you feel the somatic contractions, you feel yourself defending against it, and you work, you breathe, you open, and eventually, here's the image I have. I used to live on the shores of Lake Michigan, so this is an important image for me, and then I'll pause. So the normal contracted mind, small mind in Zen, is like a shot glass, right? So imagine a shot glass filled with water, and you take a teaspoonful of salt, which represents bitter experience, right? Surgery or heartbreak, or just turn on the news. You take that teaspoonful of salt and you put it in a small shot glass, small mind, massive effect, right? This is a really bitter pill. Take that same experience and now put it into Lake Michigan. Same experience, massively bigger holding environment, what we talked about an hour and a half ago. The space is so much bigger. The space is so infinite now that it can contain this. And now what's so great about this, Amir, the cash value here is you can now respond instead of react. Because if we're reacting to experiences, which we're always doing, that's a knee-jerk, karmic, habitual, reflexive defensive maneuver. And this is where culture wars take place, physical wars take place. We're not able to respond to others, which requires a quality of openness. We're defensively and offensively contracting. And so this not only applies to physical pain, shot glass to Lake Michigan. You have a Lake Michigan mind, or make it bigger, the universe. This is a holding environment, a mandala that can contain anything. It's spacious and accommodating. And I'll give you one last example that just floored me, and then I'll pause. I say this all the time, but I keep talking. When I was writing my book on preparing to die, I had the great opportunities when I lived in Asia for over a year in Nepal. I had the opportunity like I mentioned, hang out with all these amazing masters. And I specifically went around and I interviewed 20 or so amazing, amazing meditation masters. And I'll never forget the interview I did, and you'll see how this comes into play with a master called Tenga Rinpoche. You can get a glimpse of this if you watch the movies called Tukdam. You know about Tukdam, subtitled Between Two Worlds. It's a post-death meditative absorption thing. Super cool stuff. But anyway, so I knew Tenga Rinpoche because I had worked in his monastery. I serviced his community.
What's that movie called? Sorry.
It's called Tukdam, Thukdam, Between Worlds, or something between two worlds.
Great.
And so it's really about this super interesting state, post-death meditative absorption that's actually now being scientifically studied, by the way, with Richie Davidson and his team. And so anyway, long story short, I went in to interview Rinpoche for my book. I wanted to ask him some questions about how to prepare for death. And I entered his private quarters. I'd been there many times. And when I stepped in, my breath was taken away because here he was in the corner. I mean, the poor man should have been in ICU. He was blind from his diabetes. He just had both legs amputated. And you'll see in the movie where he talks about the monk that was attending him, basically said, Rinpoche, well, how was it? He goes, oh, best day of my life, best experience of my life. Are you effing kidding me? And so here I am in his presence. And the guy, I mean, he was a train wreck. I mean, this he ended up dying, by the way, like 6 weeks later. He was on death's door. And Amir, I came up, I almost, in fact, I said to his attendant, I said, "Are you sure it's okay that I'm here? It's like this is like death's door." And Rinpoche heard me. He said, "Doctor, Amshila, in Tibetan, Amshila, come here." So he comes over and I sat at his feet, and I mean, like tears were in my eyes because this guy he had to be in a heap of hurt. And he was beaming, he was open, he was smiling. Was he in total denial? Not a chance, man. This guy was so open. He transitioned his identity from outer form, which is what ego is, exclusive identification with form. He had already retreated to this infinite empty space of his being, and therefore he held what was happening in his outer body with such grace and dignity and equanimity and ease. In my languaging, he didn't care about his fading tan. His body was going to crap, but his mind was abiding in this indestructible cessation. This is active cessation state where he was no longer being adversely affected. So we get people like Tenga Rinpoche, Thich Quang Duc, we can be like them. We have the same heart and mind as they do. And so when we have a hernia surgery, or we get dumped by a lover, or we get fired, or we're dealing with this god-awful meta crisis, we feel the contraction, we feel it, we honor it, we don't try to get rid of it. We change our relationship to it, obstacle into opportunity, we open to it. And then you develop this fearless gusto in relationship to how you live your life because you realize you can't hurt space. So long riff on some really rich topics that when they're really brought to mind, heart, and to life, these are game changers. These are big deal changers.
And how are you for time, by the way?
Well, I'm good for time. I'll go anywhere on any topic. My only slight concern, and this is actually so sweet, fun, I'm a little slightly concerned, Amir, that, the topic on luminosity and emptiness is so profound. It's so deep that if you want to go there, we maybe I don't want to be obtrusive, but maybe we can just seed it and then come back and really talk about this. Like we start with emptiness and luminosity, because I mean, this is the core topic in my opinion. And everything I've talked about, by the way, can be absolutely framed, recontextualized within this kind of paradigm of luminosity and emptiness. But because the topic is so subtle, I think for your listeners at the 2 hour mark, they're going to go, "There's no way I'm hanging in here anymore."
Yeah, what I was thinking to myself is like if we start to go that down, like we can just reschedule and do it another time, or I would split this video at this point and be like, okay, now we're going to dive into this debate, and this would be like a new video starting from kind of the next question if you wanted to talk about it today. But you've been speaking for a couple of hours now. If you we can schedule another time and chat about it.
Well, what to do? I'm almost inclined, with your permission, to just, I mean, maybe we can just start to seed it, and then jump into it because I rarely prepare. In fact, I never prepare for a podcast. I just show up. But because of the subtlety, the nuance, and the depth, I actually put together a couple incredible supporting statements, which I never do in a podcast. And so I think to pay, and also after 2 hours, I do start to get to the wee bit tired. I mean, I'm okay, but maybe just a little bit on it, and then we reconvene. Maybe we can come back to some, we talk about the nocturnal meditations for now or whatever. Because this to me, well, not between you and I, we can share this. This conversation on luminosity and emptiness is the absolute perfect follow-up to both Jay's conversation, the one we did with the gang. And because we barely started to talk about luminosity. That's the whole gift of the Shentong. And so this, to me, would be a wonderful way to bring both Jay's conversation and the one we did into real harmony and concert. But in order to do that, because you can imagine, like I mentioned earlier, the entire corpus of the Buddhist teachings, the three turnings, 2/3 of it are on emptiness, 1/3 of it is on luminosity. There's a lot to say here. And I wanted to do it, like I mentioned in my email, with a handful of contemplations and on-the-spot meditations. So people go, oh, I get it. I get it. Otherwise, it's just philosophical bullshit. So anyway, that would probably be my preference. Because I just want to pay homage to
Yeah, yeah.
the depth of the
Well, I'm
nuance.
wondering the way you framed it now, I'm wondering if we even do it as an event and invite people and people can sign up and join in, if there's going to be guided experiential aspects.
I leave
Uh,
that up to you. That'd be fun. Yeah.
yeah, rather than just a dialogue on it. If you're up for that, that could be good. Because yeah, there are a lot of people interested in that topic, as I've now
Well,
discovered.
it's it's hugely important because I know the peeps that you talk to and they're great. I know Chris Wallace. I interview Federico. I've read everything that Rupert's written. Bernardo, of course. So you've got you represent this really cool scene, right? And it really is awesome. And so hopefully what I can do, what we've done with Jay and what you've done with Jay and the group is now you're bringing in, the Buddhist tradition. You're bringing in, maybe it's a balancing thing, maybe, but just it's another voice to create a more comprehensive approach to these really profound topics. And it's not merely the limitations of Prasangika that we can talk about. It's the limitations of Advaita Vedanta, at least as I understand it, and some of the issues that I see around respective blind spots. So this is another way of saying this is such a deep, rich topic. There's so
Yeah,
much to say.
yeah.
My whole book, I mean, if you want to get a taste of it, this book, Dreams of Light,
Wow.
this this is my favorite book of my 9 books,
Uh,
outside of the one I'm just sending to my publisher now. This book, this whole book, Dreams of Light, is about the subtlety of emptiness and luminosity. And so, yeah, obviously, I have a lot to say on this topic. And I think, again, I think your listeners would really be interested because it creates a bigger lens, a bigger way of like, oh, this is what the Buddhists say by this, and this is how this relates to that, and most importantly, how can I practice luminosity? How can I practice emptiness? The soteriology behind it is really, again, for me, that's the most important thing. So
so just for anyone that hasn't heard and isn't familiar with this debate, so maybe we'll just frame it a little bit, just
yeah,
to give the context of what this next conversation will be. Um, maybe I'll do my best in putting it into my words, and then you can like
I
bring
love
your
it.
expertise and
You
yeah.
have a real gift of doing that. So yeah, go for it. I'm sure it's
Well,
gonna
I
be.
do my best. Obviously, I'm not a scholar or an advanced practitioner in any of these traditions, so it's but I think that's sometimes quite useful to hear it put in the words of someone who's newer, because maybe it's more accessible to people who are brand new to it and have no idea. But um, yeah, so my understanding is we have these two great traditions, idealist traditions, idealism in the West, or Advaita Vedanta, or non-duality on the one side, and then you've got various traditions in Buddhism which emphasize the emptiness of things, or what other Western tradition would you put in that camp? Would it be postmodernism or
Yeah.
like color
Yes.
with
Well, yeah. Right. Yeah. Derrida, Foucault, the postmodernists, the radical relativists, they approach that. Quantum physics, quantum mechanics. I mean,
some
so
interpretations of that? Yeah.
well, exactly the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. I mean, Sergei Rinpoche says that one of the best things you can do to understand emptiness is understand QM. And then also general systems theory, deep ecology, chaos complexity theory.
Mhm.
Any particular view of reality that works in a multifactorial, systemic, holistic way is going to be intimating holistic
Mhm.
emptiness principles for sure.
Yeah. So we've got this big question of like, what is reality? What is fundamentally real about reality? And then typically, just to make it very binary, you've got this physicalist or materialist response, which is, okay, we can boil things down to atoms, and then you've got the subatomic particles, but basically things are physical and consciousness is an emergent property out of certain configurations of physical stuff, which creates a hard problem of like, well, how come some stuff is conscious, some stuff isn't? And then the idealist response to that, or and my understanding of some interpretations of non-duality is no, you've got it the wrong way round. Reality is basically made of consciousness, And the metaphor used a lot is the dream. Just like in a dream, as you said, you can have all the experiences you have in waking life in a dream, but clearly it's all made of consciousness. If I'm walking down the beach in a dream, there's no real sand there, but it feels like sand. There's no real ocean there, but it's wet like real ocean. And reality is like one large mind, and we're all perspectives of that one mind on itself, experiencing itself. So that's kind of a nutshell of the idealist view, which is saying the substrate of reality is consciousness itself, and in and that view is seen in some traditions, if I've understood, to fully understand and then embody that is a realization which one could call an awakening, or there can be a reduction in suffering accompanied with that. In contrast with some schools in Buddhism and other traditions, which say, no, not even consciousness is fundamental. The question is flawed. There is no fundamental substrate to reality. Everything depends on something else, and you'll never find a kind of base level of reality upon which everything else depends. And then we had this Titanic between these two amazing minds, Bernardo Kastrup, that was bringing the Western idealist view of the substrate of reality is consciousness or subjectivity, with, and then J. Garfield presenting the Prasangika, a Prasangika, which is a subset of Tibetan Buddhism, which is a subset of global Buddhism, the view which is, no, you haven't gone all the way if that's your perspective. Consciousness too is empty of an, and when they say empty, they don't mean kind of like spacious, empty of inherent existence, um, not something that exists independently of other causes and conditions, which is kind of mind-blowing. If okay, and the argument went back and forth, like, well, how can you say something exists and depends on something else if you never get to a point where you get to a base level of things existing? How was my
That's pretty good.
how was my
That's pretty,
summary?
yeah,
And then
that's
you're
pretty
going to
good.
come in. So we recommend listening to that debate and
Yeah,
maybe the follow-on before, but then you're going to come in and
clear it all up.
yeah,
Yeah.
and clean up that big mess.
Yeah, that's pretty damn good. Yeah, so much to say here. But basically, yeah, spot on. And so, whew, so much to say. So,
But if you give us the headlines of like what your talk
yes,
what your
yes,
talk will accomplish, hopefully.
yes, exactly. So there is something incredibly impactful about critiquing what Jay did with the Prasangika view, the whole notion of consciousness. And we talked very briefly about this, you may recall, in the conversation with Bernardo, Michael, and Carl about consciousness. This is subtle, but it's important. Consciousness is actually a pejorative term in Buddhism, by definition. So when the non-dual people talk about consciousness, and Rupert sometimes does this, he says consciousness synonymous with awareness. That's fine. But if you just use consciousness alone, Vijnana, Vijnana, this is by definition dualistic. And so when traditions assert the primacy of consciousness in the Buddhist tradition, this is called the Chitta Matra, or mind only school, where they fundamentally reduce everything to consciousness, moments of experiencing consciousness. Well, then the Prasangika comes in exactly like you said and takes out its blade and says, no, no. And so then they take apart, they deconstruct consciousness. And so what we're going to be talking about when I come back, and this is important, the languaging actually is revelatory. Jnana, jnana, is virtually synonymous with non-dual awareness wisdom. It's like virtually synonymous with the awakened space, non-dual awareness. You put the prefix VI in front of it. VI, the prefix means divided, bifurcated, fractured. And so this is very compelling. That what we know as consciousness is dualistic, bifurcated, fractured wisdom. And so therefore, anytime you use consciousness, it always, by definition in this tradition, this is why the granularity is so elegant, it always implies duality. And so, what I mentioned briefly in the conversation, um, I think I mentioned the term threefold purity and threefold impurity. We can definitely unpack this when we come back. We live in the world of consciousness, dualistic world, subject, object, and then that which seems to connect. consciousness. That's actually called threefold impurity. And the reason it's called threefold impurity, and the path is in fact to purify, is consciousness doesn't connect. Consciousness separates. Consciousness divides. And so when you get rid of the V or you transform the V, the divisions and
So
the
could we
collapse.
almost say like V, how do you pronounce it? Vijnana?
Vijnana. Yeah, in Bengali is Vijnana with a like a G, not a J.
That's
In
almost
Sanskrit.
like the left brain
Nice.
associated, making distinctions between things. It's more like an analytic um,
Nice.
consciousness.
Exactly. And in fact, very briefly, yeah, look at Jill Bolte Taylor's work, My Stroke of Insight. She had a massive left hemisphere stroke. She basically entered a non-dual space, right hemisphere exclusive space. It's a really interesting way of looking at the neural correlates to this, not causes, but correlates. So yes, that's exactly right. And so therefore, then the path, and this is what we're going to really talk about when I come back, is that this is key. I mean, from going from consciousness to wisdom or awareness, from vijnana to jhana, is in one way the essence of the whole path. And so when we do that, you go from threefold impurity to threefold purity, where the whole illusion, and when I come back, I will give you three, four different exercises so you can see this for yourself. I promise you, you do these contemplations and these meditations, you will see this for yourself. That the threefold impurity is then purified to threefold purity, where subject, object, consciousness collapse into each other. Then they become non-dual. You can say provisionally, and this is another very subtle criticism of Advaita Vedanta. You can say, they say it's one. Well, no. Yes and no. It's none. So put the one up there, and then Ruben does this. Our friend Ruben Lockenden does this in his papers. One of his recent papers is from many to n1, so none. So it's actually not one, because this is exactly what Nagarjuna did with Prasangika. His method was called non-affirming negation. He didn't affirm anything. And that's why he became so frustrating and by design to anybody who came to him. He basically said, I don't have a view. I'm just going to cut the shit out of your view, right? You come to my table and I'm going to butcher you. And so that's where it's called non-affirming negation. He didn't affirm anything. Svatantrika Madhyamaka and Advaita, they affirm oneness. I get it provisionally, the languaging, I get it. But again, languaging here is really important. It's not one, and it's not even none, but none is closer than one. And people are listening and going, oh God, here we go, back to the sophist philosophical bullshit. No, our language, words have meaning, words carry weight. And so this granularity between consciousness and non and awareness is important. The difference between one and none is important. So when you get to these extremely subtle, refined dimensions of reality, the way you work with your languaging is incredibly important. And what's even more important is you have this threefold pedagogical approach, where you go from hearing, languaging, to contemplating, reflecting on it. And then it's like walking a plank. You walk the plank to the end, and then you have to jump because you cannot get this with a conceptual mind. Ego cannot attend its own funeral. Duality cannot experience non-duality by definition. You literally, what happens is you can get an intimation of this every night when you fall asleep, when you go unconscious in deep, non-dual, dreamless sleep. Consciousness cannot experience this, which is why we black out when we fall asleep. But someone who has experience with these practices and does luminosity yoga, sleep yoga, yoga nidra, well, guess what happens? Just like I mentioned earlier with the expansion and contraction thing, they open, they expand, they maintain 24/7 awareness. Ramana Maharshi, I mean, so many of the great siddhas can do this. People in the labs today, the work of Thomas Metzinger, Jennifer Winch, there's a bunch of people actually studying this. So I'll pause because, again, you see how excited I get. This is the kind of thing that we can really unpack, and it is incredibly important because this is the irreducible, what I will talk about is the irreducible description of reality and then the irreducible description of duality. In other words, what is, like you're alluding to, Amir, what is the reduction base? Does it in fact bottom out into something? Well, philosophically, doctrinally, yes, it does bottom out into what I hope to share with you. So this is where I just get so excited about this stuff because you can't get any more profound, you can't get any deeper than this, in my opinion. So I can't wait.
That's brilliant. And maybe you don't want to go into it now, but just the kind of initial, which is potentially more of an intellectual objection with, oh, cessation proves that consciousness, any form of consciousness. So yeah, you're using consciousness to mean specifically discerning consciousness. What do you call just the jhana, the non-dual awareness? Not the okay, so the non-dual awareness seems to be dependent on causes and conditions, given the fact that it's not me claiming this, but my friends who are in this camp who have had cessation or refer to cessation say, okay, yeah, I've experienced this non-dual, non-conceptual awareness, which is vast, open, there's no obvious sense of self, there's no time, etc. And yet even that can fall away and come back. And that proves that even this non-dual, what feels so fundamental, it feels beyond and above or behind all experience whatsoever, even that is dependent. Is that
No.
an intellectual argument or is that an experiential, something that has to be experienced?
Yeah, no, this is the difference between aduality and non-duality. They're not the same. There's a lot that's called pre-trans fallacy. There's a lot of this conflation fallacy that takes place when you're using very similar languaging. This again is why languaging is so important. You're talking about certain particular experiences that sure as heck sound like non-dual spaces, well, or transpersonal spaces. But upon closer examination, they're not non-dual, they're adual. They're pre-personal, not transpersonal. And so what we're talking about here, again, this is where school's different. This is where debates take place. That what we're talking about here, and this is where when I come back and I'll talk about the primordial Torah, the Kaduma tradition of the Jewish mystical tradition, Kaduma means primordial, ancient, elemental. This is pre-Judaism. This is pre-religious. It's like Dzogchen. Dzogchen isn't even Buddhist. These two schools, in a certain sense, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, but I don't know as much about those. These are pre-temporal, pre-spatial, pre-causal. They're before the whole construct. And so, with that in mind, what we're talking about here is not constructed. It's not dependent. It's completely ineffable. And what I'm going to try to do, like Alan Watts said, is F the ineffable. And you can watch me F it up. We're trying to drop into something that actually subscends. I like it better than transcends because it implies this openness, relaxation, and descent, the waking down into this dimension. This subscends space-time causality. It is changeless by nature. It is pre-causal, pre-temporal, pre-spatial. And so this is where I would debate with these individuals and say, to me, it sounds like you're talking about an adual experience, not a non-dual experience, pre-personal, not transpersonal, and you're falling into a classic pre-trans fallacy. So this again, oh geez, oh here's some more philosophical bullshit. No, it's not. This is really important, granular, and this is why in the conversation with the scholars, Michael and Carl, when these translators go to work, and I respect them, the way they work with languaging is incredibly important because there's so much distortion takes place with just the languaging that you use. And when you get to these non-dualistic terms, well, good luck because you're using a dualistic medium to try to shrink wrap an ineffable non-dual experience. It's impossible. And so what happens is this is one reason you can tell you're in this wrestling match. Irony, paradox, contradiction run rampant when you try to bring dualistic mechanisms to understand the non-dual. It doesn't work. So hence you have to hand off the baton from hearing what we're doing here to the more subtle dimension of contemplating, which purifies it because it becomes more embodied. It's like a filtration purification system. So the meditations I'll introduce, they actually work that way. They actually work as a filtration purification system where you go from from impure concept, dualistic, we need it. I'm not dissing it. We need it. Well, you filter it. You go down as you wake down into the wisdom of the non-dual body. Contemplation, less conceptual, more embodied, more non-dual. But even then, that has to be handed off to the fundamental wisdom of the body, meditation. This is completely non-dual. This is completely embodied and completely pure. And I love this because then it brings back into play the extraordinary importance of the body. That you're going from how do I say it? Transforming cerebral data into somatic fiber. You're dropping into the wisdom of the body. And this is incredibly important because don't take my word for it. Don't take Bernardo, Rupert's, or anybody else's word for it. Do the contemplations, do the meditations, and see for yourself. And then you'll come up and then see if you have a better way to describe this stuff, right? Oh, yeah, I'm a musician. I probably communicate this better when I'm playing the slow movement of a Beethoven sonata. You can probably communicate it better with poetry. In fact, I know you can, or with dance or with, the arts. This is the way to communicate it. But since you and I, and we like to flap our lips and people like to listen to the wind that comes out of it, we do the best. Like what did Ajahn Chah say, if you try to understand the stuff conceptually, your head will explode. Well, we're going to use our head before we blow it up. And to me, this is the great gift of this pedagogical approach, which is both in Hinduism and Buddhism. Don't take my word for it, man. Do the investigations, and I'll guide you through them. I mean, I promise you, I will guide you through them. Do the meditations, see, feel for yourself, and then you'll go, ah, ha, ha, now I get it.
Great. I really look forward to it. Yeah, so I'll get hold of you to figure out some dates.
Can't wait.
This has been a brilliant conversation. I kind of feel like you've been channeling that huge library behind you and then pulling it through your mind and then out of your mouth. And I feel like
As
I've
long as
gone on this big journey through Tibet and through India and through, the whole um, spiritual journey you've been on. So thank you so much. Great to meet
it's
you
a delight.
more.
Yeah, coming from you,
Yeah,
those words mean a lot. I have tremendous respect for what you're doing. You're so skilled at this. Your ability to hold the space. There's the notion of holding environment again. Your kindness, your own wisdom, just creates this environment that's really quite beautiful. And so to be part of it is a real delight for me, and I'm honored and I'm touched that you'd be willing to go into these topics. It means a lot to me personally. So thank you.
brilliant. Thank you so much. Quick announcement. Off the back of this discussion, we arranged a full online workshop with Andrew Holecek on the 4th of September, which you can find at adventuresinawareness.com.